Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webcast today. We are really excited to have you today with us. We've got Greg Katz, who is our Chief Architect of Foresight IT Solutions. And Greg is going to be walking us through Windows Virtual Desktop and what this means for education. Greg is an expert in Azure and has completed countless WVD deployments, and he's truly the expert to give you the inside scoop on how to make it work for your school. So, Greg, we're really excited to have you today, and I will go ahead and turn it over to you so that we can get started.
Thank you. Thanks, Stephanie. I appreciate the time today for everyone. We're going to go through a lot of content on Windows Virtual Desktop. Lots of changes have happened just in the last week or so with the spring release. And as we go through the agenda, let me share my desktop real quick. And Stephanie, if you can go ahead and just allow people in as they're coming in. Great. Can you verify that you see the desktop?
I do. We do.
Okay, great. So we're going to talk about Windows Virtual Desktop today, and a lot of what I'd like to do is pepper it with, the real world experiences, what's been going on in the field with Windows Virtual Desktop. And, through COVID, there's been a lot of change, a lot of churn within our client base as far as how are they doing remote working, how we're doing remote learning within your school systems. So today we'll talk about first doing an overview. What do we see when we have Windows Virtual Desktop? There's a couple different implementations of it. We'll go through what the basics are for the overall deployment. And then I want to jump in and talk about the spring release. And with the spring release, which came out on April 30th, if you read all the trade rags and the blogs, what were the changes that were implemented and what can you expect from that? And then I think the gut check is, do we actually do that deployment today? Do we do what we call now the November deployment, or do we do the public release or preview release of that spring release? And I think it depends on when you're going into your deployment. So we'll talk about that. The other thing is, what can Foresight do to help you? And we've got next steps. We've got Q&A that we'll have throughout this. And Stephanie will be pinging me with questions in the IM session as well. There's a lot of different scenarios that we're typically seeing when it comes to Windows Virtual Desktop. A big part of that, though, has been around security and regulation. With the education and healthcare communities that we work with, we're seeing a lot of that remote worker type capability. The other thing that we are seeing is lab classrooms and what our clients need for labs. And I want to differentiate two things. One is Azure Labs, and then Windows Virtual Desktop. And I think, most people are looking at Windows Virtual Desktop today, but there are those niche areas where it might make sense to look at Azure Labs and do a classroom deployment of Azure Labs for those students. And then there's specialized applications, whether we're looking at something like ArcGIS and AutoCAD type capabilities. Number of my clients have been rolling out. We just went through a full rollout with one client with NV6 virtual machines. So these are the GPU-based virtual machines, very large, and it provides you a lot of capability, but it's also something you want to make sure you have cost controls around and making sure those are the only users that have access to it and you're getting exactly what you need. Virtualization hosts, the ones that we have typically seen, you either had a desktop or a server desktop experience. the multi-session environment with Windows Server. You can have multiple sessions. The Office was a perpetual license that you had to set up on the client, and you do this with Citrix as well. And then you had a long-term servicing channel. How long were you going to do those updates? How were you going to do those updates? With Windows 10, you had a native single session experience, and using Microsoft 365, using the Pro Plus, you also had a channel update for this and be able to perform those updates on the clients. But one of the things that was introduced with Windows 10 was the idea of doing multi-session. And in particular, one of the things that I love the most about this is when we'll talk about architecture, but when you look at a host pool architecture, one of the things that is recommended, and we recommend as well, is doing a validation pool. And a validation pool allows me to do feature updates and patch updates within that pool and test it there before I roll that out to a majority of the users. So looking at it as a staging ground for that, and we do that with that Windows 10 Enterprise multi-session. I usually think of this as server deployments because when we're looking at the enterprise pool, we're looking at basically, here are virtual machines that we're deploying in an availability set in Azure, and it's just a number of users or a number of session hosts that you have available for those particular users. Okay. Windows Virtual Desktop benefits. We can deploy now a full desktop environment or deploy different application pools in what's called an application group. So it's a matter of how do you want those end users to be able to interface with the virtual desktop environment. Do they need to have a full desktop environment, or do they need to just have the applications that are specific to them? And I've seen both types of deployments at Foresight. So with this, you can support Windows Server 2012 and R2 and above. And you also have that ability to extend and look at Windows 7 Virtual Desktop with the extended security updates. One of the big things, though, that you get with Virtual Desktop that I didn't see with other VDI environments is now, there's two parts to this. One is it's deployed with Active Directory domain joined machines, but it's also using Azure Active Directory. So you get all the security benefits of that and the management of Microsoft 365 and Azure Active Directory. So what do I mean by that? I can have conditional access and things like MFA for the users, multi-factor authentication for those users as they access the tenant. So it gives them an opportunity to have a very secure footprint for the environment. The other thing that's done differently with Windows Virtual Desktop is it's a reverse connection. So instead of here are all the ports that I have to open, everything is done over an SSL connection and tunneled back through that to your organization. So I don't have to look at a lengthy group of ports that need to be open in order to have this. And this provides me a very secure type of environment for my installation. This, though, is probably one of the biggest benefits and game changers, I think, when we look at Windows Virtual Desktop. And that is, if you're licensed for A3 or A5 or student use benefits, basically this replaces doing what we had in the past with an RDS Cal. So no remote desktop license is needed outside of this. If you're licensed for A3 or A5, you can go ahead and use Windows Virtual Desktop. And then you have all the other caveats for the different clients. And then if we were doing for server, you have an RDS Cal that you can go ahead and use. The full pricing and everything for this you can find at azure.com at the link that's provided as part of the presentation today. The other thing that I think is very important to point out is a lot of the clients I'm working with, we're doing pilots, or we're doing proof of concepts for. We're doing, typically a pay-as-you-go a type of instance. But one of the things that's been introduced is that reserved instance and hybrid licensing that can go ahead and reduce your costs down to 60, 70% of what it was to just do a pay-as-you-go virtual machine. And now Microsoft has introduced monthly payment options for those reserved instances. So a great way to do it is go ahead and work with your reseller, go ahead and purchase those reserved instances and apply that directly to the virtual machines that you have. That's going to save, just a boatload of money. So what does the deployment overview look like? And, I'm going to give you the small what's in it in a nutshell, and the particular pieces that you are responsible for as a customer of Microsoft and Foresight. So high level, VDI environment always had a broker, you had management, load balancing, everything. But if you see in that red box managed by Microsoft, this is a PaaS environment now, a platform as a service. So no longer do I have to have, my information as far as what do I need for an RDS gateway, how am I going to do diagnostics, how am I going to make sure that I have access. The thing that you're looking at is you have to build the virtual machines, you have to load the applications. That's the part that you control. Everything else is managed by Microsoft and managed by the platform itself. Now, there are things that we want to look at as far as tuning and taking a look at how we do scaling, but everything else is managed there by Microsoft. The other thing that and we'll talk about patches, but the patch management feature update, because these are domain joined machines, I can use SCCM, I can use Intune to go ahead and manage these particular workstations that are part of this host pool architecture. So this allows me to have a very robust environment and be able to just manage what's important to me, which is those applications and those workstations that are connecting for that. So prerequisites on deploying Windows Virtual Desktop. And you can get started today if you go to our website and go /WVD. First step is, what's the identity? And typically what we'll do is use Active Directory domain integration with your Azure Active Directory. The virtual machines will have to be domain joined, so there's rights, and we'll talk about the rights and the permissions that you have in your system. And then there's a site-to-site VPN that connects to your domain infrastructure. And typically what we'll do is we'll put a virtual machine, a domain controller in the cloud for you. And you can replicate and use that as fault tolerance as well for your Active Directory environment. One of the things that Microsoft did last year is they purchased a company called FS Logix. FX Logix was pioneering the use of UDP, user profile management for VDI environments. And what you see here is the different ways in which you can do storage. You can do it with a typical file server, and the file server that we're talking about has to be something that's in Azure Active Directory. And I'll show you the different storage pieces that we have. The way that we're doing the deployment is using Azure NetApp files. And NetApp files provides me with the SMB share, but it also provides me with a high level of IOPS that I can have and fault tolerance for that integration piece. It's very easy to set up. We need a DNS, we need a domain join that environment, and then set up the SMB share, and then we can go ahead and configure it with FS Logix. So it's very easy from a deployment perspective. It's in, I believe it's in 5 different data centers now in the US. and it gives me this robustness that I need in order to have something that's close by and provides me with my user profiles. And there's a lot you can read around FS logics and profile container management. What are those registry settings? Of course, most of the time what we're looking at is what are the GPOs that you have that you want to use those group policies to go ahead and deploy that information. Credentials that are needed. You're going to need subscription administration. You're going to need an Azure AD global administrator, Active Directory administrator, and a WVD tenant admin. WVD is the RDS tenant. And today, what I'm talking about are what's released with the November edition, because the way Microsoft is doing it, and what you'll hear, I think, more now, are seasonal updates to the Azure subscription service. So today we've got the WVD admin and consent forms that you do as part of the update, and that will be rolled into the updates that we'll talk about in the spring update. So credentials are required. You have the RD client on the left-hand side. You notice there's a web client, and then there's clients that we have across the board. Linux client, you've got iOS, you've got Mac client, and you've got an Android client. So there's a lot of different types of scenarios, including thin clients, that you can use for the RD client. Windows Virtual Desktop environment, we need to have an RDS tenant and WVD admin for that environment. And then the subscription is overall for the entire subscription of Azure. And we need an Azure AD global admin that will administer the virtual machines, the applications, the desktops, and Azure Active Directory, and how we do the updates from there. So those are the credentials that are needed when we're looking at any of the deployments. Network requirements and considerations. As I mentioned, the virtual machines have to be domain joined, so we have to have a way of getting and traversing the network and getting to Active Directory. And this is why we've decided in our deployment to go ahead and use Active Directory and put a domain controller in your Azure tenant. Network must be able to route in that piece, and we must be using Azure AD Connect to synchronize the users from on-prem to Azure Active Directory. One of the limitations, and it's being addressed by the spring release, is that with Active Directory, we cannot do groups and we cannot do nested groups. So that means everyone that's assigned remote desktop user privileges for the WVD environment need to be added individually. And I'll show you what we've done in our environment so that we can go ahead and quickly use Azure Automation to do that. As far as the other considerations, you can do a site-to-site VPN. Typically, a lot of our greenfield deployments will do a site-to-site VPN and use a 100 meg connection, but you can go ahead and have multiple types of VPN connections. We can also look at ExpressRoute, and that could be a way in which we can go ahead and do that overall deployment. So if we take a look, I wanted to show very quickly here. By the way, this is the full client. We'll take a look real quick. I am logged into a host pool, and hopefully we're seeing this is a 4K drone footage of Croatia. I don't think you'll see any people on the island, but maybe, this is 2018. So yeah, you'll be able to see people on the island. If I look at my environment here, one thing I wanted to point out is Azure Automation. And there's two things that we're using for Azure Automation. One of them is we're using logic apps and actually defining parameters around the Azure deployment when we want to scale up and when we want to scale down based on peak hours of utilization for those users. So with WV Automation, this is our account that we're using. We've got a bunch of different run books that we have in here. And the one that I want to point out If we look at the run books, the auto scale is the one that uses logic apps, but the WVD add users one, what this does, and I'll just edit it real quick so we can take a look at it. This one allows me to add users from a specific group ID object in an Azure Active Directory group. So it allows me to take a sync group, Azure AD Connect sync group, and provide that ID for that group and then add users into the system, because the only way to add users to be able to use it is get RDS app group user. In this one, I remove all users and then I re-add them here. So making sure that if they're not in that group, I can go ahead and remove, and then I'll add them back into the group. Okay. So Azure Active Directory is needed for that. We've talked about Azure AD Connect and the express route capabilities there. When we create, the first time that we create our Windows Virtual Desktop environment, we have to give consent to the RDS environment, that WVD tenant, to our Azure subscription. So if you've ever tried to get into the RDP client and you didn't have the full URL, what you'll end up typically with is a consent form. There's both a server and a client consent form. It gives rights, and those permissions are identified on Microsoft's site. It gives Azure Active Directory consent to the environment. The next thing that we do is we assign a tenant creator in Azure Active Directory, and usually what we'll do for that is not use a user principal name, but use a service principal name, so that we have that user always tied to this particular service. And then in PowerShell, at that point, you'll go ahead and create your tenant for Windows Virtual Desktop. Once it's created, then we get to the automation pieces. We want to go ahead and create and provision host pools. We want to update virtual machines in an existing host pool. And then we want to set up a scaling script. And we've talked about what that scaling script looks like. But there are things that you want to think about, like how long is the session duration? What do we want to do with those sessions when that person has been disconnected for a period of time? How do you want to drain those sessions? All those are types of questions that you use when you're talking about the Azure automation. So we provide the template, we provide the way to go ahead and do the updates for that environment. FS Logics, we mentioned profiles are stored in a virtual hard disk. For that user profile, they're mounted at login, and it provides this really rich, fast environment. We're using NetApps to go ahead and provide this block transfer and network utilization in that same networking environment. You can also use caching and the Windows Cache Manager and Cloud Caching to go ahead and provide that type of integration and failover for the environment. But basically, when it comes down to it, what we're talking about is an SMB storage. We need to have some way of storing that is tied permission-wise to your Active Directory environment. When we look, there's a couple of different pieces. Azure Files, you can do a hybrid join. This is still not the recommended method today. So the two on the right are the NetApp files, and the storage space is direct. Foresight uses the Azure NetApp files. It provides the redundancy, and if you look, it also provides you with the overall best performance when it comes to IOPS. You can do up to 320K of IOPS with 4.5 gigabit per second per volume and less than a millisecond of latency. So it's a great performing environment for our WVD. And the minimum capacity that you want to have for that is a 4 terabyte pool, capacity pool. And you can go ahead and define what you want for the size for your VHDs. And then from there, you can also use that for other things, as a typical NAS device for that. As far as the images, I mentioned you can use System Center. You can use third-party tools. You can use Azure Update Management. There's been a lot of debate whether um, you want to turn off the registry or turn off GPO to do Windows updates and use SCCM or one of those other tools to do the updates, or you want to go ahead and redeploy a new image and redeploy a brand new host pool for the environment. And I think the difference is in where your administration comes from. So if you've done typical VDI environments, a lot of times it's just a rip and replace. We're going to go ahead and we're going to do updates periodically. We're going to snap in a brand new image and redeploy a pool. And it becomes that very consistent method for that. And if you come from the traditional administration, then you're looking at patch management and SCCM, and you just want to go ahead and deploy that and define what hours you're going to go ahead and deploy that management. So that's the patch management piece of it. As I mentioned before, you also want to do a validation pool. So taking a look at when do you do updates, how are you going to do those updates, and are they just patch updates or are you doing feature updates? If they're feature updates, how is that going to perform against all the applications that I have in my pool? So these are great ways in which to go ahead and manage the overall environment. I wanted to have a quick slide here just to talk about the profile management. This is all in the FS Logics piece. Profile containers are where that VHD container lives, and you'll set up the SMB drive for that. It's easy to manage. You can go ahead and delete those VHDs if you've got a corruption, but this allows you to have a very fast log on time for the environment. And then Cloud Cache allows me to make changes on that back end and provide a caching component, just like you do with lots of other Azure deployment areas. You can go ahead and provide that caching up front for the environment. There's been video and graphics improvements when it comes to WVD, 4K sampling. The video I was showing was a 4K. You can actually do video, audio within the sessions and have smooth playback. The one thing you want to look at is there is a WVD performance metric, and take a look at that website, make sure that you have the correct performance that you need for those particular sites. So with all that said, that's what's released today. Now, last week, we had a public preview, spring release of Windows Virtual Desktop. Lots of changes were announced with this, including the fact that it's a complete ARM objects within your Azure tenant. So with this, everything's updated. It's in the mainstream now. It's a first-class service with WVD, and I can do all my scripting and updates directly in the PowerShell. Including things like AZ role assignment. All those things are now included in the spring release. The other thing is groups have been added. So now I can publish directly into those groups. Now you can't do nested groups, but you can do a group and go ahead and provision based on that group. So, I'll show you some of the graphics that we have when it comes to the spring release. You can use Azure to do roles-based access control. So looking at which administration you want to have for this, who are the users that we want to delegate and provide that capability. And then one of the cool things is I can actually add hosts right there within that scale out set that you have with the host pool. Another thing is because now it's part of the mainstream, I can use all the tools in the Microsoft arsenal. I can use Azure Monitor and look at, pulling that information into Power BI, for instance, and publish that in Power BI. So on the right, I've just got a chart that shows what that performance against the session host pools looks like. So what are some of the things? The first thing is because it's not something in another tenant, I can go ahead and create a host pool directly not from the marketplace, but directly from the services that you have for Azure. So go and create a host pool. These are the parameters that, if you've done any of the deployments before, are going to look really familiar to you. Whether you're looking at a personal or a pooled information, session limits, and the load balancing algorithm. So are you going to do breadth, or are you going to do depth as part of how you do your overall host deployment? When we create the host pool, you can add the virtual machines, or you can add them later and register that key. How many VMs do I want to have? Where is my image coming from? Is it within a gallery and I'm using that gallery, or am I using a default image? Is it going to be a managed disk? And here's the networking that you provide for that. This is just showing you I can go ahead and set all the parameters for domain join. You use a distinguished name path for the OU, and you can go ahead and add that OU in here. And then what is that domain joiner account that you're going to use? Go ahead and add those workstations into your Active Directory. Once they're in there, like I said, you can use SCCM. You can use the tools at your disposal, manage those machines just like you do other machines. Workspace, this is the new area where everything lives within Windows Virtual Desktop. So you're going to create a new workspace, and then it asks you if you want to create a desktop application group. There are two types of groups. You've got a desktop application group, and you've got an application app group. It comes back to whether I want to deploy the entire desktop, or I want to deploy just an application for that environment. So I'm deploying to the workspace. My deployment has been complete. Typically, this is going to take anywhere from just a few minutes to probably 30 minutes for your deployment, according to what you have for VMs. And there's a number of things that I've seen that could go wrong in this area. One is if you don't have permissions. You don't have any of the Active Directory permissions. You don't have the Azure Active Directory permissions. The other thing I've seen is, are you provisioning something like a GPU type, an NV series, and you're trying to provision to a data center that doesn't have that type? So it's important when you're talking about what do you do to prepare, are you getting that right information and those details that you need for the deployment? Here I've got a host pool, and if you look, I can look at the application group, and I can look at the virtual machines for this. In the virtual machines, I've got their status is available. I've got PL0 and PL1 that I have, and how many active sessions do I have? And what's great about this is I can also drain those servers right from here. And everything is done through the graphical interface now. So it gives me the opportunity to continue to do things in PowerShell, but also use the portal to go ahead and manage that virtual machine environment with the host pool. And then the application pools. By default, I've got a desktop application group that I've defined, but I also can define remote application groups. I can also change the session limits that I have for each of those. So here's the load balancing algorithm. I'm using a breadth first, which is by default. Typically what we'll see is a combination of this. I might use some of them that are more depth-based and some that are breadth. RDP settings was something that I can only do from PowerShell. Now I can say for my host pool, I don't want them to have, I want redirection for disk drives. I want clipboard to be on, printers to be on, the audio output to be on, and play sounds from that computer. So all of those settings can be done now through the RDP settings. Here's the big one, assignments. I can now assign my users directly from the Azure portal, not, look at, it's still a hop to a hop. So it's still Active Directory users. They're synchronized to Azure Active Directory. And then I'm assigning them to, this workspace and to this host pool. But now all I have to do is add that Azure Active Directory synchronized group. So in this case, I've got a WVD Windows 10 multi-session pooled group. I usually don't make mine that long, but then I can select that and all those members of that group are automatically assigned. The other thing is with applications, and this was great as well, because if you have lots of applications and you're doing an application app group, now I can, as long as it's in the image, it sees everything that's in the start menu, sees all the applications that are loaded, and I can choose to only do the applications that I want from that drop-down list. So I don't have to think about what is the directory path for that, where is this located. Everything is right there at your fingertips within this deployment. And then finally, it's looking at that application group and who's assigned and how many applications are assigned. So I can see in the Microsoft Office application group, I've got 6 applications that have been assigned for that one. And then it's been deployed. So I say that it's been deployed and there's simplicity, but there's a lot that Microsoft has done to simplify the overall deployment with the spring release. That being said, is it ready for you to go ahead and deploy? It's according to what time frame you're looking at for your overall deployment. If you're looking to deploy right now during the COVID crisis, then I would stick to the November launch. If it's something that you're looking at for the fall term, for instance, then I would start looking at that spring release, which is in public preview and should be released sometime in the summer. I don't know the exact date, but it should be in that time period. And then you can go ahead and test out the pieces for this. The benefits for the spring release, as you could see through the screenshots, it's phenomenal. But both the November option and this option, the underlying piece, the administration is changing, but what you get overall with Windows 10 multi-session, that hasn't changed. So it doesn't matter which release you're going to, it just matters on how you're going to administrate that overall deployment. So in this case, what you're seeing is I've got 7 applications that have been published. I also have a session desktop that's a full desktop deployment that's been situated. So the other piece that you have for this is looking at Azure Labs. And if you've ever configured at your school a lab environment for your end users, one of the things that you have with that is what's the deployment of that lab look like, and when can I do updates? And do I need to do it twice a year? Do I need to do it 4 times a semester? What does that look like? And it can be very time consuming and expensive to go ahead and do that. The other thing is the students are coming with a variety of desktops for the environment. So how do you accommodate that? Bring your own device for these lab environments. And maybe it's a dorm room exercise that you want to enable them to be in their dorm room and utilize this versus coming to the classroom. Especially with today, you're probably going to have them working or doing their assignments from home, and they can go ahead and utilize one of these devices to join. So Azure Lab Services provides these lab services as well as you can have an image that you define in order for them to be able to use. And one of the things that differentiates this between this and Windows Virtual Desktop is, within the budget and the pricing model that you have, this is an all-you-can-eat classroom environment. So you'll have a set price tag that you have on the asset, and you can go ahead and assign users within a classroom. So the administrator of the class can go ahead and just add users to that. You can define what types of VMs you have for that environment, and then just budget that particular piece. You can also set startup and shutdown times. So you're only using it when those resources are available, and you're scheduling that, and you schedule that through your calendar. So with this, you can publish all of it, send your invites to it, and the students can be up and running in just a matter of minutes for this environment. In this, you set up an instance that has a classroom. This one has 4 cores, 8 gigs of RAM. It has so many lab units that you have, and then the full pricing calculator. So you can go ahead and look at this scenario is 50 students with 40 hours of allocated lab time per month. And I can see what the overall cost would be for that particular instance and doing that work. Obviously, this could be, engineering lab. I want to have a very beefy box, and I can go ahead and do that with Azure Lab Services and provide that scenario as well. So here I've got my Azure Lab Services. I am part of Richard's lab, and I can go ahead and start playing in that playground. And this could be, for instance, maybe I've got a Azure for Research machine, and I can use an R lab and go ahead and do that through Richard's lab. So this is what the students would see as they've gotten the invites. They would see the classrooms that they have. And they also see at a glance if they've got time remaining in that system or not. So it gives them the opportunity to look at, how they're managing their time and how they're connecting and stopping that, and manage the hours and the credits that they have for that particular machine. So when you're thinking about remote learning and remote working, you've got 2 different options. Looking at how can I quickly do that with Azure Lab Services, and what can I do with Windows Virtual Desktop for everybody that does remote work. All right, so differentiate between the 2 and what you have here. So what are the challenges? I think we've covered quite a few of the challenges, but the client experience and multi-session environments. Most of the VDI deployments that you have today are single session. Windows 10 announced the multi-session in 1909 series of Windows 10 provides me an ability to work with the applications in a very cost-effective fashion. The other thing that we've introduced now is FS Logics, and with Foresight, we have the ability to go ahead and set this up. We're doing it with Azure NetApp files and providing that OneDrive and that Teams experience in that installation, as well as your full Office deployment with that perpetual life, or not that perpetual, what that subscription looks like running in a multi-session environment. We also, there's an ability to migrate your existing desktop and applications to Azure. So looking at longevity, looking at what you can do overall to extend, those workstations or extend the life of the environment that you have. The other thing is, it's a quicker deployment. There's some planning that's involved, and that's why Foresight is there to go ahead and help you and be side by side with you. But you can deploy very quickly. It's a matter of looking at the prerequisites, and do I have Active Directory access? Do I have the permissions to go ahead and do this? And we've seen everything where we've got some clients that are ready to go, and we can deploy a pool in a matter of a couple hours. And then we have some that we walk through setting up an Azure subscription, setting up a site-to-site VPN, working with their VPN appliances, and going through that full deployment and showing them what the governance is along the way, and how do you do tagging, make sure that you've got the billing set up right, and you understand cost and billing for that Azure deployment. So how do I get started today? And one of the things that we've done at Foresight, and I want to thank Stephanie for the great work that she does in marketing, is provide you a quick start offering. And with this quick start, what we can do is examine your existing infrastructure, deploy a tenant if you don't have a tenant already for Azure, set up your site-to-site, set up your Azure Active Directory Connect, make all the connections, basically all the widgets and whistles that you need in order to do all the prerequisites. Then work with your team to give you access to go ahead and build the gold images that are needed for the host pool deployment. We'll deploy the host pools. We'll deploy two host pools as part of Quick Start offering. We'll deploy FS Logics along with NetApp files to go ahead and provide you with that secure environment. We'll also set up testing on one of those pools and scaling, so you can see what that looks like and go ahead and make changes as you continue to run that environment, and also set up your users. We will use the November deployment today, but we're looking forward to utilizing the spring deployment as we get closer to summer deployments here. With the benefits that you get with WVD, you'll be able to virtualize those desktop and applications, be able to assign those users quickly, and have both remote learning and remote work capabilities. And I think that one of the big things is you can reduce that overall CapEx cost that you have today. Move that to more of an OpEx cost. Look at what you define as part of those parameters for setting up WVD. And, we just want to be there to help you, realize this virtualization environment, and dealing with the COVID crisis, and just in general how everything has changed. Because I think one of the things we'll have to talk about is what changes post COVID. Right? Do we continue to have these remote environments? And every client conversation that I have today includes that. We're talking about we're going to keep this environment moving forward. We're going to extend what our university, what our school looks like, and the capabilities that we have overall. So I would think of this as, let's get started with what that Windows Virtual Desktop environment looks like for your organization. So I want to thank everyone for the session today. What I want to do now is I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if there were any questions that we have in the queue. And Stephanie, if you want to go ahead and open up for questions as well, we can go ahead and take a look at that.
Thank you, Greg. That was really great. I hope everyone got a lot out of that. We certainly are here to answer any questions. If you've got them, go ahead and send them over. We've got one. Is it possible to log in to WVD using local AD users?
Those local AD users would be synchronized to an Azure Active Directory account. So they are local users. They would just need to be synchronized.
Okay. Yeah, so we can just hang out for a minute and see if there are any more. But certainly we are available even after the webcast to answer any questions. If you want to send emails to info@foresightIT.com, and we can put you in touch with Greg in the right resource. That would be great as well. But yeah, we're really looking forward to everything that has come with the spring updates, and then of course this fall, and having access to that.
Great. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining today. And like we said, we'll hang out for a few minutes, and look forward to any emails. You can reach me at greg.katz@foresightIT.com. And for any information, please use the info@foresightIT.com or contact Stephanie and I, and we can go ahead and answer your questions as well. Thank you.